All right, so now I wanted to get into the slides that I've been discussing a little bit earlier. So Natalie, if you can first identify the color coding on here, because this is demonstrating all of the land that your organization has preserved. Mm-hmm. So the color, so you can explain to the community the color codes, what they mean.
Absolutely. So like you said, we're looking now at a map of, it's almost the entire coast of South Carolina. And it's sort of split up into focus areas that are sort of along the lines of watersheds. And so our focus area is the Cause Basin focus area there in the middle. And that stands for the Cooper, Ashley, Wando, Stono Basin. So it's the convergence of all those rivers. And for the colors, what you're seeing on here is the green are properties that have been protected by the Lowcountry Land Trust. And then the orange is other privately protected property. And then the gray is public lands. So all three of those colors are protected property. And when you kind of step back and look at it, at scale, that's a lot of land. We have a couple of really big concentrations of it where the National Forest is and bigger parks and stuff, but it is a lot of privately protected land. That's a huge number of landowners that have voluntarily decided to restrict development forever. And I think it's notable in the context of the growth, the population growth and development pressure. It's notable in the context of other states and how they're doing, and even other parts of the state. I think it's there's been a lot of effort from Lowcountry Land Trust, all of the other conservation organizations, the community, and landowners to be proactive with this. I mean, a lot of these easements were in the 90s and early 2000s, and so we really got a good start on land protection.
So does this add up to the 150,000 acres that you referenced earlier on?
It's more. So the green, the Lowcountry Land Trust has 150,000 acres.
So that's why I wanted to bring it up. So just the green is 150,000 acres.
Yes.
And that's quite notable.
I don't know the total, but it's a lot of land.
I thought it was 2 million, but maybe not.
We'll have to get back
on
that.
Well, we got to get the total number. But yeah, it's good to look at it in this context to see that a lot of our watershed is protected, because when we go to the next slide, you see that we don't have a lot of Johns Island protected. Yes. Which, I think is part of the motivation here, is that there's success. We're off to a good start, but we really need to make some progress on Johns Island.
So let's go to the next slide. So Collie, with the assistance of Natalie, can you explain the color coding on that particular slide?
Yes. Okay. So as mentioned, it's the same here. Everything in green has been protected by the Lowcountry Land Trust. You will see that highlighted in blue are those lands protected by the Kiawah Conservancy, whether that's through a conservation easement or fee simple owned by our organization. Everything else in orange is protected by is other protected lands, whether it's the county, public lands, stuff like that.
So the blue, I'm sorry for interrupting, I just wanted to identify, that would be the acreage that you referenced earlier?
Yeah, the dark purple there. That would be the 3,860 acres. And a lot of that, you'll notice, has been the marsh and hummock islands around Kiawah Island. What's unique about Kiawah's marshes is that they actually have a king's grant to them, so it dates back to the King of England. So you can actually trace that title back and have full ownership of that marsh. Anything that doesn't have a king's grant was technically owned by the state. And so for us, our organizations, we can't necessarily put a conservation easement on anything that doesn't have clean title.
Can you explain what a king's grant is?
I'm going to let Natalie explain a little bit farther about what the king's grant is. She has a little bit more history with it than I do.
Well, I mean, you kind of gave a good overview of it, and I'm certainly not the expert, but like Collie said, what we have in South Carolina is called a public trust doctrine, and that doctrine says that all of the salt marsh and navigable water is held in trust by the state for the benefit of the public. So that's why when you're out on a kayak or paddleboard or something like that, and you're paddling along the salt marsh and everything, that is the purpose of the public trust doctrine. And so in the 1700s, the when people were staking out the land and stuff that they were owning out here, if you got a grant from the king to privatize that salt marsh, to say this is actually mine to the exclusion of others, then you have a clear title of ownership to that marsh. And what that means in practice is, like I said, you can exclude others. And so if somebody wants to try and build a dock across your marsh and you have a King's Grant, you can say, no, I can keep you out. I'm going to appeal that. I have ownership of this. I get to decide what goes here and what doesn't go here. If you don't have King's Grant, then you don't have clear title and you can't necessarily keep the public off of it because, according to the public trust doctrine, it is owned by the public. It's owned by the state, held in trust for the public.
Good.
So it's important. You know, I will say a lot of easements, I mean, we encounter this, we are on sea islands. So a lot of the properties that we're working on have salt marsh that's excluded from conservation easements because the land trust can't be in a position 20 years from now, 50 years from now, where somebody's trying to build a dock and that we don't have that right to exclude them from that property. So we can't defend in the future unless you have a King's Grant. But what we can do is put easements on the upland and wetland areas that are not part of that salt marsh, not past the critical line. And that, in essence, protects a lot of the salt marsh. So you're protecting that, I heard a biologist refer to it as the ecotone fringe. It's sort of the transition zone between salt marsh and uplands, and that's where a huge amount of the species are that we're trying to protect. A lot of the breeding ground, a lot of raising young is in that area. And so if we have an easement on the upland, you can't start a dock from that point, and go out into the marsh. And we're also protecting that area as sea levels rise.
Sure.
There's marsh migration space and whatnot. So it provides a little bit, the King's Grant thing provides a little bit of a complication with some of the boundaries sometimes. But it really is, it's a unique thing to South Carolina, and that
is very unique. Yeah,
it's a strange conversation to have with landowners sometimes.
That's right.
I say, you don't really, you don't own in full the stuff that's past the critical line most of the time. But
so there's another important element that I wanted to highlight on this slide. It has to do with the urban growth boundary, Collie. So it's an orange line on the slide, and could you explain what that urban growth boundary means?
Yeah, so the urban growth boundary line is simply a tool that is recognized by council, and it was created by Charleston County Council, that basically says where rural land shall remain and urban growth shall stop. But it's not an ordinance. It's not set in stone. It's just a guiding tool for that, for where development and the intensity of development should stay. And so we follow that as if we can keep all the intense development within that urban growth boundary line, then everything around it should remain rural and agricultural lands. Right. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, and really the purpose of it is for a lot of different reasons, but cities and towns, it costs money to provide services. So it doesn't make economic sense for a city or a town to have very dense zoning and residential development really, really far from where the rest of the services are. They have to provide trash and fire and, there's water and septic and all the infrastructure, roads. There's a lot that goes into providing for development. And if it's not in the right place, it is astronomically expensive for a city or a town. And so for the city of Charleston to be providing services out on Wadmalaw would make no sense at all. That's how you make municipalities go bankrupt. They're spending all the money and not getting it back in taxes. And so it's an important line for cities and towns and the county, because they have a responsibility as it relates to where the development goes. It's an important line for us for planning. It's sort of tied to what the county calls their future land use map. So, which is slightly different than the zoning. It's a little bit broader brushstroke to say this is what we see this area looking like 10 or 20 years from now? And so it gives us a good idea of where we hope to expect growth and where we don't, and where it makes sense to invest in land conservation and where it doesn't. And I think more specifically for us, there is always the threat of the more demand, more population growth. Is that line going to move out? Are we going to try and make more space for residential development? And it's important that we all recognize that there's plenty of space inside the urban growth boundary, so we don't need to move it out. But it's also a good place for us to focus on land protection. And so it's a great place for parks. It's a great place for conservation easements right outside the urban growth boundary, because it provides a more permanent delineation between where we're going to be focusing growth and where we're not.
So there's a couple points I want the community to know about the urban growth boundary. One of them, if you can see on the slide, the borderline as of today is right down the middle of Betsy Carrison. So on the west side of Betsy Carrison, that's protected. I shouldn't say protected. That's rural, and on the east side, it can be developed. The other takeaway is that the urban growth boundary can change.
Correct.
And that's why I wanted to ask this questions and point that out is both of your organizations are very active in preventing or trying as much as possible to stop the relocation of the urban growth boundary, because it could shift, and Betsy Carrison could become urban growth on both the east and the west sides.
Yep, and it only takes 5 votes at county council to move that urban growth boundary line.
Right.
And so that's what we worry about when we see certain developments pop up that test that boundary line. It can almost act as a domino effect. When one person or one developer gets that change, then, okay, well, we allowed it for this developer. We got to allow it for the next one, right? And so you have to be careful with that. As Natalie mentioned, there's plenty of space inside the urban growth boundary line for development to take place. And I don't think either of our organizations are against development. We're just for the right development in the right place. It's about growing with the environment and not against it. And so we always have to keep the environment in mind, because you can't stop growth. I mean, it's going to happen, but let's try to think about it in an eco-friendly way and center it in areas that make sense for urban growth.
Right. So a concern that I personally had with respect to the urban growth boundary is on the slide that we're looking at. Perhaps in the middle of the page, you can see where there is a pocket of development. I think it's in the purple colors or whatever, but somehow that little pocket was allowed to take place. And if development is allowed to continue on the growth side of the boundary, that kind of pocket of development we can see up on the east side of Betsy Carrison.
Yeah.
Can you explain if there's anything in particular that you guys are working with the councils or other organizations to try to freeze this boundary as much as possible?
Well, one thing we try to do is when we're talking about or trying to identify lands for conservation is what properties lie on that urban growth boundary line. Because if we can conserve those lands, it helps define that urban growth boundary line and keep it where it is. But yes, there's been a lot of talk. The Johns Island Task Force does a good job with this too, in meeting with council, trying to urge this to become more of an ordinance and a rule versus just a tool or guiding tool. Make it steadfast, and so that you can't just change that urban growth boundary line with 5 votes. So it goes beyond just our organizations working on it and advocating for it, the community, and there's all different opportunities for the community when a development pops up or is proposed outside the urban growth boundary line. It has to go before the normal process of county council to get rezoned. And there is time for public comments, to submit your comments online, and even show up in person to advocate against it if you are. And that sits well with the county council. Those are our main ways of advocating for it, along with land preservation along that boundary line to secure it. Anything you want to highlight extra?
Well, I was just going to share a little bit, we have a ecosystem of organizations and community members and groups that are involved in all of these kinds of issues, and they overlap a lot. And so what we're, primarily talking about today is land protection and the role of land trusts. And Lowcountry Land Trust is not an advocacy organization or a land trust. And so we, our bread and butter is holding conservation easements. We go and visit them once a year to make sure that they're not all, 550 of our properties. We go check and make sure they're not being violated or, built on in a way that they're not supposed to. So that's our primary role. But we fit well and sort of work in this ecosystem, what Collie was alluding to, of advocacy organizations, of the community, of public engagement. And it's really the combination of all of the stakeholders that is crucial to keeping the urban growth boundary where it is, to keeping our elected officials on the same track of this longer term vision that we all have, this shared vision of how we should be developing the islands and how we should be balancing growth. And so I just wanted to underscore that we're playing a role in this, but there are many roles for individuals, whether you're a landowner, whether you're renting, whether you're just visiting, once every 10 years to come and walk on the beach. You still are a stakeholder in what this island looks like. And, to the extent that you value the fact that you're driving through farms to get out here to Kiawah Island or to the beach, the fact that you're stopping off at the farmers markets on Sunday or Wednesday to get vegetables or that sort of thing, to the extent that you value any of those, then, you have a voice and hopefully a sense of responsibility to participate. And there's roles for everybody. Mm-hmm. And, when it comes to roads, when it comes to development, when it comes to proactive things like comprehensive planning, there's all sorts of ways that people can help us and help each other stay on the right track.
That's why we're all here in the base case.
Right.
I think our organizations really try to act as like a platform to, have a voice, put some science behind the reasoning for keeping certain areas rural and certain areas urban. But, we're happy to the Conservancy is happy to take an advocacy role that's in our mission now. So we do come out and voice our opinion. If something is zoned a certain way, we don't necessarily advocate against that right because it's a vested right with the property owner. But anytime you try to test that boundary line in upzone, that's where the Conservancy would step in and advocate that the land should remain in the current zoning that it is.
Thank you for doing that. So the very last slide or the picture I wanted to discuss, I guess falls into Natalie's camp, although, Collie, I don't want to intentionally exclude you, but it has to do with Wadlama Island. And I'm only referencing Natalie because I thought she had more involvement on that. But I like this particular slide because it shows for that particular island a large amount of protected land.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give you then the opportunity to brag again how you were able to help Wadlama become so well protected.
Well, thank you for bringing this up because I actually, when you asked about success stories, I was like, Wadlama. And that is the success story, at least so far in my mind. So just a little bit of context, Wadlama is roughly half the size of Johns Island. Johns Island's about, 50,000 acres, 48,000 acres or so. Wadlama is about half the size of that. And there is a very, very long-standing community on Wadlama that has had a very clear vision for how they would like that island to remain. And so in the 80s, with passage of the Conservation Easement Act, and then in the early 90s with the Comprehensive Planning Act, Charleston County had zoning, and so therefore they had to adopt a comprehensive plan. And sort of parallel to the zoning efforts and advocacy efforts, you had a number of landowners who voluntarily, at that time there was no grant funding available for conservation easements. It was just if a landowner decided to restrict their property, they'd have to work with a land trust and try and do it. And so there were a number of landowners who decided to do that and really led the way for, they saw how much work it was to keep zoning and keep county council on the same page with how they wanted the island to look. And so, it was a very collaborative effort of landowners doing their part, community members getting engaged in the comprehensive planning. And over the years, we've gotten to the point where we now have over 30% of Wadmalaw protected. It's at 31.7%.
That is an awesome number.
Which is really, really huge. I mean, for comparison, Johns Island's 8%, 8% protected. So, we have a ways to go, but and Wadmalaw does too. They're, the vision, as I understand it, is very rural. And so to the extent that they're continuing to do conservation easements, continuing to defend the zoning, to put more protected property on the map. And I'm sure y'all have heard there's been a lot of science over the years that says we should be protecting at least 30% of habitat, of land, of, that's a starting point for what we would say is a good balance. And so Wadmalaw is a great example of that. You look at that map and you see everywhere that's dark green will never be a subdivision. Right. It will never be a safe.
It is a success story.
It will never be industrial. It will, it's never going to be a shopping center. It's never going to be a Walmart superstore. It's never going to be any of those things for hundreds of years, forever. And so Wadmalaw is an example, I think, of the community and of landowners sort of taking their future in their own hands and playing the role and putting in time and effort over years and years to make permanent that vision that they have. And so I think that's a really good takeaway, for our work on continuing on Wadmalaw, but also on Johns Island. It's a little bit harder because there's a lot more neighborhoods. It's a bigger island. There's a lot of different feels when you're driving around. It feels a little different on one side than it does on the other. And so we don't have quite as much of a cohesion, but I think Wadmalaw is just such a good example of if you put in the time and the commitment and people are willing to, put their money where their mouth is in terms of development. Yeah. If, I'm never going to develop my property and I want to leave it to my kids and I hope that they never develop it, well, let's put a conservation easement on it and make sure.
That's the only thing that's set in stone.
You still retain value. You still keep ownership of the land. It's so it's a big decision for a lot of people. And I think seeing other landowners like those people on Wadmalaw who have done this and love it, they take pleasure every day in the fact that the tree that's in their front yard is not going to get cut by them. And if, next generation is not going to get cut by them either. So it's, I just think it's really great that Johns Island sort of hugs Wadmalaw because it's, without it, we'd just be at 8% protected and wondering how the heck are we going to get any farther than this. But we have a great example of what it looks like when there's dedication to that vision. And I think we're seeing tons of landowners on Johns Island get continually motivated by that. The more that they hear about landowners on Wadmalaw and the more they want to do that too. So,
well, I'd love to be able to say Wadmalaw will then become the Johns Island success story, and continue to have the conservation and preservation that both your organizations are working so hard. So we're at the end of the podcast. One thing that came shining through to me was your passion and your excitement for what you do in both your respective organizations. And we on Kiawah and Johns Island and the Lowcountry in general are very fortunate to have both of you guys so passionate involved in protecting the environment. But is there anything else you'd like to say and before we sign off? Yes?
Just a couple things. And, I wanted to kind of highlight when you were looking at this Wadmalaw Island map, something to note there is there's a few standalone properties, but a lot of them are connected. And contiguous land preservation is so important to connect these parcels together to create wildlife corridors for our wildlife to travel, but to encourage your neighbors to preserve their land as well. We recently did an interview with Side-Eye Limehouse when we put their family property under conservation easement off on the other side of the Kiawah River. And he said, whether you got 1 acre or you got 100 acres, you're not, when you put a conservation easement on it or you protect it, you're not doing something for your lifetime, but you're doing something forever and for future generations. And that's so important. And back to this contiguous land preservation, if you were to go on the Conservancy, the Kiawah Conservancy's preserved lands map on our website, you'll see that same initiative, right? Look at Halona Lanes, look at the Members Lane properties on Cacique. We strategize and go after properties that will link together so that you're not having fragmented conservation. While every lot's important, the more that we can get to link together is so important for not just the local wildlife, but the migratory wildlife as well, to be able to travel safely for resting, feeding, and so forth.
And that's what you're trying to do on Witzik-Harrison.
Correct. I mean, that is, when we talk about how we protect land, that is always on the top of the agenda. Does it connect? Is it in close proximity? And that's where our organizations work well together. I mean, I called Natalie this morning and said, hey, this looks like a good project over here. Do you have anything, around it that we can try to kind of piece it together and make it all contiguous land? And so that's a really good effort and a good goal to have for conservation organizations to create contiguous land preservation.
Well, once again, Collie and Natalie, thank you so much. I feel very fortunate. I feel I can probably sleep better a little bit more at night knowing that your organizations are fighting for us. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I do just want to reiterate what you said is such a great point. There's no property that's too small.
Nope.
There's nothing too big. There's not, everybody has a role to play if this is something that you care about. And I hope it's something that you care about because it impacts your life. And so, to the extent, if it's a small landowner, if you don't have funds to do some of the due diligence tasks, there's grants available. There's grants to compensate for partial donations of conservation easements. I encourage everybody to get involved in one way or another, and don't think that you don't have something to bring to the table, because I can guarantee anybody does in this kind of a conversation. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Great.
And we both work for nonprofits. So to the extent that you'd like to just support our work by donating, please do that. We appreciate all of our supporters and couldn't do this work without them. So
we're not going anywhere. Our work's in perpetuity. We started on Kiawah. We're staying on Kiawah forever, and we're just expanding our conservation work to the surrounding area. So it's going to be fun ride going forward.
What a great way to end the podcast with those words of success and hope and future. That was great.
That's right. Thank you. Well, thank you for having us.